When I decided to save myself. For a long time, I believed that life would eventually make sense on its own. I believed that if I waited long enough, if I endured quietly, if I stayed patient and hopeful, something would change without me having to change anything. I told myself that this was just a phase, that everyone feels lost sometimes, and that one day I would wake up feeling different. But days turned into months, and months into years, and nothing truly changed. I was moving through life, but I wasn't living it. I was present everywhere except inside myself, carrying an invisible weight that no one could see and that I didn't know how to explain. From the outside, my life looked normal. I did what was expected of me. I showed up. I spoke when necessary. I smiled when politeness required it. I avoided questions that went too deep, and I learned how to say, "I'm fine," in a way that ended conversations quickly. There was no single dramatic event that explained my state of mind, no tragedy that justified the heaviness I felt. That made it harder, because when there's no obvious problem, people expect you to be grateful, to be positive, to stop overthinking. And so I learned to doubt my own feelings. I learned to minimize my pain and tell myself that others had it worse, that I had no right to feel tired, lost, or disappointed. The exhaustion I carried was not physical. Sleep didn't cure it, rest didn't touch it, and distractions only postponed it. It was the exhaustion of constantly suppressing my true thoughts, of living according to expectations that were never truly mine, of delaying decisions because I was afraid of making the wrong ones. I was tired of starting over in my head and never starting in real life. Tired of imagining a better version of myself while continuing to choose comfort over growth. Slowly, without realizing it, I became a spectator of my own life. I spent years waiting for clarity. I thought clarity would come before action, that confidence would come before effort, that motivation would come before discipline. I waited to feel ready, but readiness never arrived. Instead, doubt became familiar, fear became comfortable, procrastination disguised itself as patience. I told myself I needed more time, more knowledge, more support, more reassurance. What I really needed was honesty, but honesty was the one thing I avoided the most. Deep down, I knew I was betraying myself. Every time I ignored my intuition, every time I chose silence instead of truth, every time I postponed a difficult decision, I felt it. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly and persistently. It showed up as self-disrespect, as frustration, as a growing distance between who I was and who I knew I could become. The problem was not that I didn't know what to do. The problem was that I was afraid to take responsibility for my life. For a long time, I hoped someone would save me. I hoped someone would see my potential and push me forward. I hoped someone would understand me deeply enough to guide me. I hoped circumstances would change in my favor so that action would feel easier. I didn't realize that this hope, as comforting as it seemed, was slowly keeping me stuck. Waiting for rescue was easier than facing myself. Waiting for permission was easier than choosing courage. The moment of realization did not come with drama or intensity. There was no breakdown, no tears on the floor, no turning point that looked powerful from the outside. It came quietly, in the middle of an ordinary day, when I suddenly understood something simple and uncomfortable. No one was coming. No one was going to fix my life for me. No one was going to make the hard decisions on my behalf. No one was going to save me from the consequences of my own inaction. At first, that realization felt heavy and lonely. It felt like abandonment. But slowly, as I sat with it, it began to feel different. It began to feel honest. And honesty, even when painful, carries a strange kind of freedom. Because if no one was coming to save me, that meant I still had a choice. It meant my life was still in my hands, even if I had neglected it for a long time. That was the moment I stopped asking why my life felt empty and started asking what I was willing to change. I stopped blaming circumstances, people, and timing and began to look at my own patterns, my excuses, my fears, my habits. I realized that saving myself did not mean becoming perfect or fearless. It meant becoming responsible. Responsible for my thoughts, my actions, and the direction of my life, even when progress felt slow and uncertain. This book is not written from the position of someone who has everything figured out. It is written by someone who spent a long time avoiding himself and finally decided to stop running. It is not a promise of quick transformation or instant success. It is a reflection on the quiet, uncomfortable, and deeply human process of rebuilding yourself when you realize that no one else will do it for you. If you are reading this and feel tired without knowing why, if you feel behind in life, if you feel disconnected from yourself, or if you keep waiting for the right moment to begin, this book is for you. Not because it has all the answers, but because it speaks honestly about the questions that matter. The moment you decide to save yourself is not the end of your struggle, but it is the beginning of your truth. And sometimes that decision alone is enough to change the direction of your entire life. Chapter 1. I was alive, but not living. There was a time when I realized that being alive and truly living were not the same thing. I didn't notice it all at once. It wasn't a sudden shock or a clear moment of awareness. It was something I felt slowly, like background noise that never stops. I was breathing, moving, talking, and functioning, but inside I felt disconnected, as if my life was happening somewhere slightly out of reach. Days passed, weeks passed, and I participated in them without really feeling present. I was existing, but I wasn't engaged. I was surviving routines, not creating a life. I woke up every morning with the same feeling, a quiet heaviness that I couldn't name. Nothing was technically wrong, yet nothing felt right. I followed habits I didn't question anymore, spoke words I didn't fully mean, and accepted days that looked exactly like the ones before. Time moved forward, but I felt suspended, as if I had paused my own growth while everything else continued. The scariest part was how normal this state began to feel. I adjusted to it. I stopped resisting it. I told myself this was adulthood, responsibility, reality, but deep down, I knew I was slowly disconnecting from myself. I learned how to distract myself well. I filled silence with noise, thoughts with entertainment, and emptiness with temporary comfort. I stayed busy enough to avoid reflection, productive enough to avoid guilt, and tired enough to avoid change. Every time a quiet moment appeared, something inside me felt uncomfortable, so I pushed it away. I didn't want to face the truth that I was living below my potential, not because I lacked ability, but because I lacked courage. I convinced myself that feeling unfulfilled was normal, that everyone felt this way, that life was about enduring more than enjoying. I watched others talk about purpose, passion, and direction, and I nodded along, pretending I understood. In reality, I felt lost, not dramatically lost, but quietly disconnected. I didn't know what I wanted, and I was afraid to admit it. Admitting confusion felt like weakness. Admitting dissatisfaction felt ungrateful. So I stayed silent, even with myself. The more time passed, the more distant I became from the person I once imagined I would be. I remembered a version of myself that had curiosity, ambition, and hope. That version believed life could be meaningful, that effort mattered, and that growth was possible. Somewhere along the way, I traded that belief for safety. I chose predictability over possibility, comfort over challenge, and approval over authenticity. It didn't happen in one decision, but in hundreds of small choices that slowly shaped my reality. I avoided discomfort whenever possible. I avoided difficult conversations, avoided risks, avoided responsibility for outcomes I couldn't control. I told myself I was being realistic, but in truth, I was being afraid. Fear didn't show up loudly. It showed up as delay, hesitation, and endless preparation. I was always getting ready to start, always planning to change, always promising myself that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow became a place where I stored my courage so I wouldn't have to use it today. The hardest part was how disconnected I felt from my own emotions. I wasn't deeply sad, but I wasn't happy either. I wasn't angry, but I wasn't peaceful. I existed in a numb middle space where nothing felt urgent enough to change. That numbness was more dangerous than pain, because pain demands attention, but numbness allows stagnation. It allowed me to stay where I was without questioning it too much. I began to notice a quiet resentment growing inside me, not toward others, but toward myself. I resented the fact that I knew better but acted smaller. I resented my excuses, my inconsistency, and my tendency to blame circumstances instead of choices. Every unfulfilled promise to myself weakened my self-trust. Every time I chose avoidance, I felt smaller. I didn't hate myself, but I didn't respect myself either, and that was worse. Living this way slowly affected how I saw the world. I became more critical, more cynical, more distant. I watched opportunities pass and told myself they weren't meant for me. I watched others move forward and told myself they were luckier, braver, or more capable. I used comparison as a way to explain my inaction, instead of seeing it as a mirror showing me what I was avoiding. At some point, I realized that my life felt heavy not because it was difficult, but because it was unintentional. I was reacting instead of choosing, following instead of leading, and waiting instead of building. I had given up control without consciously deciding to. And when you give up control long enough, you forget that you ever had it. The truth was uncomfortable but clear. I was alive, but I wasn't living. I wasn't growing. I wasn't challenging myself. I wasn't becoming anything new. I was repeating days and calling it life. That realization didn't immediately change me, but it planted a seed of awareness that refused to disappear. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. This chapter is not about blame. It is about recognition, because before you can change your life, you must be honest about the life you are living. You must notice the patterns you've normalized, the fears you've justified, and the potential you've postponed. Admitting that you are not truly living is not a failure. It is the first act of courage. I didn't know how to fix everything yet. I didn't have a plan, clarity, or confidence. But for the first time, I stopped pretending. And that honesty, as uncomfortable as it was, became the beginning of movement. Because the moment you admit that you are alive but not living, you open the door to becoming someone who does both. Chapter 2. The silent exhaustion no one saw. The exhaustion I carried was not something people could notice easily. It didn't show on my face in obvious ways, and it didn't stop me from functioning. I still showed up. I still fulfilled responsibilities. I still responded when spoken to and smiled when expected. That was part of the problem. From the outside, everything looked fine. There was no visible breakdown, no dramatic collapse, no clear sign that I was struggling. And because nothing looked wrong, I convinced myself that nothing was wrong, even when every part of me felt tired. This exhaustion lived deeper than the body. It was not cured by sleep, weekends, or moments of rest. It followed me into quiet rooms and loud places alike. It appeared in the lack of enthusiasm I felt for things that once mattered to me. It showed up in how easily I became overwhelmed by small tasks and how often I postponed things that required focus or courage. I didn't feel burnt out from doing too much. I felt drained from carrying too much inside without ever releasing it. I carried thoughts I never expressed, doubts I never shared, and questions I never allowed myself to fully ask. I carried expectations placed on me by others and expectations I placed on myself without understanding where they came from.
I tried to meet standards that were unclear and goals that were not truly mine. Over time, this internal pressure became normal. I stopped questioning it and accepted tension as a permanent state of being. The most exhausting part was pretending that I knew where I was going, pretending that I was confident in my choices, pretending that I was okay with the direction of my life. Pretending requires constant energy, and when you do it long enough, you forget that you are pretending at all. You begin to believe the image you present, even as your inner world becomes more distant and unfamiliar. I rarely allowed myself to slow down, because slowing down meant thinking, and thinking meant facing uncomfortable truths. So I stayed busy enough to avoid reflection, busy enough to avoid stillness, busy enough to avoid myself. I confused movement with progress and activity with purpose. As long as I was doing something, I felt justified in not asking why I was doing it. When exhaustion finally made itself known, it didn't come as a breakdown. It came as indifference. I stopped caring deeply. I stopped feeling excitement. I stopped feeling urgency. Life became something to get through rather than something to engage with. That numbness scared me more than stress ever did, because stress still meant I cared. Numbness meant I was slowly disconnecting. I noticed how easily I became irritated, how quickly my patience disappeared, and how often I felt mentally foggy. Simple decisions felt heavy. Creative thinking felt distant. Conversations felt shallow. I was not overwhelmed by too many responsibilities. I was overwhelmed by unresolved emotions and unspoken truths. But instead of addressing them, I pushed them aside and told myself I would deal with them later. Later became a dangerous word. Later allowed exhaustion to grow quietly without interruption. Later allowed me to delay difficult conversations with myself. Later allowed patterns to solidify into habits and habits into identity. I didn't realize that by avoiding discomfort in the present, I was creating deeper exhaustion in the future. There were moments when I sensed something was wrong, when I felt a wave of heaviness with no clear reason. In those moments, I looked for quick explanations. I blamed lack of sleep, stress, circumstances, or timing. Rarely did I look inward. Looking inward felt too complicated, too unclear, and too demanding. It required honesty, and honesty required energy I felt I didn't have. What I didn't understand then was that the exhaustion was not a sign of weakness. It was a signal that I was living out of alignment with myself, a signal that my actions no longer matched my values, even if I wasn't fully aware of what those values were. Ignoring that signal didn't make it disappear. It only made it quieter and more persistent. I also learned how lonely silent exhaustion can be. When people don't see your struggle, they assume you don't have one. When they assume you're fine, they don't ask deeper questions. And when no one asks, you begin to believe your experience doesn't matter enough to share. I isolated myself emotionally while remaining socially present, and that distance grew wider with time. At some point, I realized that this kind of exhaustion doesn't come from doing too much, but from being disconnected from meaning. You can work hard and still feel energized when your effort feels intentional, but when your days lack purpose, even small tasks feel heavy. I wasn't tired because life demanded too much. I was tired because life felt empty of direction. This chapter is about recognizing that exhaustion is not always visible and not always caused by workload. Sometimes it is caused by avoidance, misalignment, and silence. Understanding that truth was uncomfortable, but it was necessary, because you cannot rest your way out of a life that is slowly draining you. You must change how you live, not just how you rest. The exhaustion no one saw was quietly teaching me something important. It was asking me to pay attention, to stop ignoring myself, to stop postponing difficult truths. Listening to that exhaustion was the first step toward understanding that saving myself would require more than rest. It would require honesty, responsibility, and the courage to live differently.
Chapter 3: Expectations that broke me. For a long time, I didn't realize how much of my exhaustion came from expectations I never consciously chose. They surrounded me quietly, shaping my decisions, influencing my behavior, and defining what I believed was acceptable or successful. Some of these expectations came from people around me, others from society, and many from versions of myself that I created without questioning. Together, they formed an invisible structure I tried to live inside, even as it slowly crushed me. I was expected to have answers, to know where I was going, to move forward with confidence and certainty. Uncertainty was treated as weakness, confusion as immaturity, so I learned to hide both. I learned to present confidence even when I felt lost and to speak about plans I wasn't sure I believed in. Over time, this performance became exhausting because it required me to constantly ignore my inner voice in favor of external approval. There was pressure to be productive at all times, to measure my worth by results, progress, and visible achievements. Rest felt like laziness, pausing felt like falling behind. I internalized the idea that slowing down meant failing, even when my body and mind were asking for space. I pushed myself to keep going, not because I felt driven, but because stopping felt unacceptable. I confused constant effort with purpose, and that confusion drained me. Some expectations were subtle, disguised as advice or concern. They came in the form of questions like, "What are you doing with your life?" or "When will you figure things out?" These questions were rarely meant to hurt, but they carried weight. They implied timelines I didn't understand and standards I couldn't meet. I absorbed them and turned them into silent pressure, reminding myself daily that I was behind, late, or not enough. The most damaging expectations, however, were the ones I placed on myself. I expected myself to be strong without support, motivated without clarity, disciplined without meaning. I expected myself to know my path without allowing myself time to explore it. When I failed to meet these expectations, I didn't adjust them. I blamed myself. I saw my struggle as a personal flaw rather than a sign that my standards were unrealistic or misaligned. I also expected myself to be consistent in a life that didn't feel true to me. I expected myself to commit fully to choices I wasn't sure about and to stay loyal to versions of myself that no longer fit. Instead of listening to discomfort as a signal, I treated it as something to overcome. I pushed forward while ignoring the quiet resistance growing inside me. Living under these expectations slowly disconnected me from my own desires. I stopped asking what I wanted and focused on what was acceptable. I stopped listening to intuition and prioritized approval. Decisions were no longer about alignment, they were about avoiding judgment. I chose paths that felt safe instead of paths that felt meaningful, and over time, that safety became suffocating. The breaking point didn't come from one big failure. It came from realizing that no matter how much effort I put in, I never felt satisfied. Every achievement felt temporary. Every step forward was followed by a new demand. There was no finish line, only endless pressure. I realized that I wasn't chasing success, I was running from disapproval, and that kind of pursuit has no end. I began to feel resentment toward expectations, but also guilt for feeling that way. I told myself I should be grateful, that pressure meant people believed in me, that discomfort was part of growth. But deep down, I knew living under these expectations slowly disconnected me from my own desires. I stopped asking what I wanted and focused on what was acceptable. I stopped listening to intuition and prioritized approval. Decisions were no longer about alignment, they were about avoiding judgment. I chose paths that felt safe instead of paths that felt meaningful, and over time, that safety became suffocating. The breaking point didn't come from one big failure. It came from realizing that no matter how much effort I put in, I never felt satisfied.
Every achievement felt temporary. Every step forward was followed by a new demand. There was no finish line, only endless pressure. I realized that I wasn't chasing success, I was running from disapproval, and that kind of pursuit has no end. I began to feel resentment toward expectations, but also guilt for feeling that way. I told myself I should be grateful, that pressure meant people believed in me, that discomfort was part of growth. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. Growth that comes from constant self-betrayal is not growth. It is slow erosion. Expectations broke me, not because they were demanding, but because they were disconnected from who I truly was. They asked me to become someone impressive rather than someone honest. They rewarded appearance over authenticity and consistency over alignment. Trying to live up to them required me to silence parts of myself that needed attention, understanding, and care. When I finally began to question these expectations, it felt uncomfortable and unsettling. Letting go of them meant disappointing people. It meant redefining success. It meant admitting that some of the goals I chased were never mine. That realization hurt, but it also brought clarity. For the first time, I saw that the pressure I lived under was not a requirement. It was a choice I had never examined. This chapter is about recognizing the expectations that shape your life without your consent. It is about understanding how easily external standards become internal rules and how damaging they can be when left unquestioned. Before I could save myself, I had to identify what was breaking me. And in my case, it wasn't failure. It was the constant attempt to live a life that looked right but felt wrong. Letting go of those expectations didn't instantly bring peace or clarity, but it created space. And that space became the foundation for rebuilding a life that was no longer driven by pressure, but guided by intention.
Chapter 4. The moment I realized no one was coming. The moment I realized no one was coming did not arrive with drama, noise, or intensity. It wasn't a breakdown, and it wasn't a sudden burst of courage. It came quietly, almost gently, during an ordinary day that looked no different from the many days before it. Nothing external changed. The world continued moving at the same pace. People around me followed their routines. But inside me, something shifted in a way I could not ignore. I had spent so much of my life waiting for clarity, waiting for motivation, waiting for confidence, waiting for the right opportunity, waiting for someone to notice my struggle and offer guidance. Waiting felt safe because it delayed responsibility. As long as I was waiting, I didn't have to act. I didn't have to risk failure. I didn't have to confront my fears. Waiting allowed me to believe that change would come from the outside, that my life would improve when circumstances finally aligned. That belief slowly became a habit. Every time things felt difficult, I told myself it wasn't the right moment. Every time I felt uncertain, I assumed I needed more information. Every time I hesitated, I justified it as patience. Over time, waiting became my default response to discomfort. I didn't realize that while I was waiting for life to begin, life was already passing. The realization came when I noticed how much energy I spent imagining rescue. I imagined conversations that would change everything, advice that would suddenly make things clear, opportunities that would remove doubt. I imagined a future version of myself who had somehow figured it all out without going through the discomfort I was avoiding. That imagination was comforting, but it was also dangerous. It kept me passive. It kept me dependent on events that might never happen. When the thought finally appeared, no one is coming, it felt heavy at first. It felt like abandonment. It felt unfair, almost cruel. I wanted to reject it, to argue with it, to replace it with hope. But the more I sat with it, the more honest it felt. No one was coming to make the hard choices for me. No one was coming to give me discipline, direction, or courage. No one was coming to live my life in my place. That realization stripped away many excuses at once. It removed the comfort of blame. It removed the illusion of perfect timing. It removed the fantasy of external rescue. What remained was uncomfortable but clear. My life was my responsibility, whether I liked it or not. Avoiding that responsibility had not protected me, it had slowly drained me. I began to see how often I had given my power away without noticing. Every time I waited for permission, every time I looked for validation before acting, every time I delayed a decision because I feared judgment, I was handing control of my life to something outside myself. Realizing no one was coming meant realizing that I had more power than I was using, and that realization was both frightening and liberating. Fear came from understanding that there was no one to hide behind anymore. Liberation came from knowing that if no one was coming, then I was free to choose differently. I didn't need approval to change. I didn't need certainty to begin. I didn't need to be fearless to take responsibility. I only needed honesty. That moment didn't magically give me confidence. It didn't erase doubt or make action easy. What it did was remove illusion. It forced me to see my situation clearly, without stories that softened the truth. And clarity, even when uncomfortable, creates movement. I stopped asking when my life would change and started asking how I was contributing to it staying the same. I stopped focusing on what I lacked and started paying attention to what I avoided. The shift was subtle but powerful. It wasn't about becoming someone new overnight. It was about stopping the habit of waiting and beginning the habit of choosing. This chapter is not meant to sound harsh or discouraging. The idea that no one is coming is not meant to create loneliness. It is meant to create ownership. Because the moment you stop waiting for rescue is the moment you begin building strength. Not borrowed strength, not temporary motivation, but the kind of strength that comes from knowing your life is yours to shape. When I realized no one was coming, I didn't feel saved. I felt awake. And sometimes awakening is the most uncomfortable part of transformation, but it is also the most necessary, because you cannot save yourself while waiting to be rescued. And once you truly understand that, the direction of your life begins to change, not because someone arrived, but because you did.
Chapter 5. Taking responsibility for my own life. Taking responsibility for my own life did not feel powerful at first. It didn't feel motivating or inspiring, and it certainly didn't feel easy. It felt heavy. Responsibility meant I could no longer hide behind circumstances, people, timing, or bad luck. It meant I had to face the uncomfortable truth that many of the things I complained about were things I had allowed, tolerated, or avoided addressing. That realization didn't make me feel strong. It made me feel exposed. But it was necessary, because without responsibility, change is only an idea, not a reality. For a long time, I believed responsibility meant control, and control felt overwhelming. I thought taking responsibility meant having everything figured out, knowing the right answers, and never making mistakes. Because I didn't feel capable of that, I avoided responsibility altogether. I chose excuses instead. Excuses felt lighter. They protected my ego and softened my disappointment, but they also kept me stuck. Every excuse quietly reinforced the idea that my life was happening to me rather than being shaped by me. When I finally stopped avoiding responsibility, I realized it wasn't about controlling outcomes. It was about owning choices. It was about admitting that even when circumstances were difficult, my responses still mattered. I couldn't control where I started, but I could control whether I stayed there. I couldn't undo the past, but I could decide how much power it would have over my present. Responsibility was not about blaming myself for everything that went wrong. It was about recognizing my ability to influence what came next. This shift forced me to look honestly at my patterns, the habits I repeated, the conversations I avoided, the decisions I postponed. I saw how often I chose comfort over growth and familiarity over truth. I saw how I waited for motivation instead of building discipline, and how I looked for confidence instead of earning it through action. None of this was pleasant to admit, but it was freeing, because once I stopped lying to myself, I could finally start working with reality instead of resisting it. Taking responsibility also meant letting go of the idea that someone else owed me understanding, support, or direction. While help and guidance are valuable, depending on them as a requirement for progress had made me passive. I realized that waiting to feel supported before acting was another form of delay. Support can help, but it cannot replace ownership. At some point, I had to decide that my life mattered enough to take action even when encouragement was absent. I also had to confront how responsibility felt lonely at times. When you stop blaming others, you stand alone with your choices. There is no one else to credit for success and no one else to blame for failure. That isolation was uncomfortable, but it was honest, and honesty created clarity. Clarity helped me see that responsibility was not a burden meant to crush me, but a foundation meant to support me. Responsibility changed how I spoke to myself. I stopped telling myself stories that kept me small and started asking questions that demanded answers. Instead of asking why things were unfair, I asked what I could do differently. Instead of focusing on what I lacked, I focused on what I was willing to work on. These questions didn't always have immediate answers, but they created momentum. They shifted my mindset from passive observation to active participation. I began to understand that taking responsibility did not mean being hard on myself. It meant being honest with myself. It meant acknowledging effort as much as outcome, progress as much as perfection. I learned to separate self-respect from self-criticism. Responsibility rooted in self-respect leads to growth. Responsibility driven by shame leads to burnout. Learning that difference was essential. Slowly, responsibility became empowering, not because my life suddenly improved, but because I no longer felt helpless. Even small actions carried meaning. Even imperfect decisions felt better than endless hesitation. I began to trust myself not because I always succeeded, but because I showed up. Showing up consistently, even when unsure, rebuilt a sense of agency I had lost. This chapter marks a turning point, not because everything changed, but because the direction did. Responsibility did not fix my life overnight, but it gave me something far more valuable: ownership. And ownership is the starting point of every meaningful transformation. Once I accepted that my life was my responsibility, saving myself stopped being an abstract idea and became a daily practice. Taking responsibility was not the end of my struggle. It was the end of my excuses. And that, more than anything else, gave me the space to finally begin building a life that felt intentional, honest, and truly my own.
Chapter 6: Facing Myself Without Masks. Facing myself without masks was one of the most uncomfortable things I had ever done, not because I discovered something terrible, but because I could no longer hide from what I already knew. For years, I had learned how to present versions of myself that felt safer, more acceptable, and easier to explain. These masks were not lies in the dramatic sense, they were adjustments, small compromises I made in how I spoke, acted, and responded to the world. Over time, those adjustments became habits, and those habits slowly distanced me from who I truly was. I wore different masks depending on the situation. There was the mask of confidence when I felt unsure, the mask of indifference when I cared deeply, and the mask of agreement when I didn't want to cause tension. Each mask served a purpose. They helped me avoid conflict, judgment, and rejection. They helped me feel included, but they also required constant energy to maintain, and the longer I wore them, the harder it became to remember what my unmasked face looked like. Removing these masks didn't happen all at once.
It began with small moments of honesty that felt risky and exposed, moments where I admitted I didn't know what I wanted, that I felt confused, that I was afraid of making the wrong choices. Saying these things, even to myself, felt uncomfortable because I had spent so long associating honesty with weakness. I believed that being strong meant being certain, and being uncertain meant being unworthy. Letting go of that belief was not easy. When I started facing myself honestly, I noticed how often I avoided my own emotions. I labeled feelings as unproductive, unnecessary, or inconvenient. I rushed past discomfort instead of listening to it. I judged myself for feeling things rather than asking what those feelings were trying to tell me. Facing myself meant allowing emotions to exist without immediately trying to fix or justify them. It meant sitting with discomfort long enough to understand it. One of the hardest truths I had to face was how much of my identity was shaped by approval. I realized that many of my decisions were influenced by how they would be perceived rather than how they felt internally. I had built a life that made sense to others, but felt distant to me. Acknowledging this felt painful, not because I had failed, but because I had betrayed my own intuition more times than I could count. Facing myself also meant confronting my fears without disguises: fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of disappointing others. These fears had quietly dictated my behavior for years, yet I rarely acknowledged them directly. I treated them as logical concerns rather than emotional signals. When I finally named them for what they were, they lost some of their power. Fear thrives in avoidance, not in awareness. There were moments when facing myself felt lonely. Without masks, I could no longer rely on familiar roles to guide my behavior. I had to decide who I was without external scripts. That uncertainty was unsettling, but it was also honest. It forced me to define my values rather than borrow them, to choose my direction rather than follow expectations. Slowly, I began to understand that authenticity is not about being fearless or perfectly self-aware. It is about being willing to tell the truth, even when it complicates things. As I removed these masks, I noticed a subtle shift in how I experienced life. Conversations felt more meaningful. Decisions felt more intentional. Even mistakes felt different because they were mine. I wasn't performing anymore. I was participating. That participation brought a sense of alignment I hadn't felt in a long time. Facing myself without masks did not make life easier, it made it clearer. And clarity, while sometimes uncomfortable, is always valuable. This chapter is about the courage it takes to stop hiding from yourself and to accept that growth requires honesty before improvement. Saving myself was not about becoming someone new. It was about meeting the person I had been avoiding. When I finally allowed myself to exist without masks, I didn't feel complete or finished. I felt real. And that reality became the foundation for everything that came next. Because you cannot build a meaningful life on a version of yourself that isn't true. You must first be willing to see yourself clearly, without disguises, before you can move forward with integrity and strength. Chapter 7. Changing the Way I Think. Changing the way I think was not a sudden realization or a single powerful moment of clarity. It was a slow and often uncomfortable process of noticing patterns I had repeated for years without questioning them. I had always believed that my thoughts were simply reactions to life, natural responses to circumstances beyond my control. I didn't realize how much those thoughts were shaping my reality until I began paying attention to them. The way I spoke to myself, the assumptions I made, and the stories I told myself about who I was and what was possible had quietly become the lens through which I experienced everything. For a long time, my thinking was rooted in limitation. I focused on what could go wrong, what I lacked, and why things might not work. I confused realism with pessimism and caution with wisdom. Whenever I considered change, my mind immediately presented reasons to wait, avoid, or stay where I was. These thoughts felt logical and protective, but they were not neutral. They were shaping my choices by shrinking them. Without realizing it, I had trained my mind to prioritize safety over growth and familiarity over possibility. The most damaging part of my thinking was not negativity, but repetition. I repeated the same internal messages until they felt like facts. I told myself I was behind, that I had missed my chance, that others were more capable, that I needed to be ready before I could begin. Over time, these thoughts stopped feeling like opinions and started feeling like truths. And when you believe something is true, you stop questioning it. Changing the way I think required me to slow down and observe my own mind. I began to notice how quickly I judged myself, how often I assumed the worst, and how rarely I acknowledged effort unless it led to visible success. I saw how one small mistake could trigger a chain of negative conclusions about my abilities and my future. This awareness was uncomfortable, but it was necessary. You cannot change a pattern you refuse to see. I also realized that many of my thoughts were inherited, not chosen. They came from past experiences, comparisons, and unexamined beliefs I had absorbed over time. I had accepted them without asking whether they were still relevant or helpful. Just because a thought appeared in my mind didn't mean it deserved my trust. That understanding alone began to create space between me and my thinking. Changing my mindset was not about forcing positivity or denying reality. It was about accuracy. It was about replacing exaggerated fears with honest assessments, replacing self-criticism with responsibility, and replacing assumptions with curiosity. Instead of asking why I wasn't good enough, I began asking what I could improve. Instead of telling myself it was too late, I asked what was still possible.
I learned that thoughts are powerful not because they are true, but because they influence action. When I believed I was incapable, I acted cautiously. When I believed effort was pointless, I delayed. When I believed growth was possible, even uncertainly, I showed up differently. My behavior changed before my confidence did. That was an important lesson. Waiting for confidence before changing behavior had kept me stuck. Acting first gave my mind new evidence to work with. This process required patience. Old thinking patterns don't disappear quickly. They resist change because they are familiar. There were days when I fell back into old habits of thought, doubted myself, and questioned whether any of this effort mattered. But I learned to treat those moments as part of the process rather than signs of failure. Growth is not linear, and neither is mental change. As my thinking slowly shifted, so did my perception of challenges. Problems no longer felt like proof of inadequacy, but like information. Mistakes no longer defined me, but guided me. Uncertainty no longer paralyzed me, but invited exploration. I didn't become fearless, I became more flexible, and flexibility turned out to be far more useful than confidence. Changing the way I think didn't make life easier, but it made it more honest. I stopped fighting my mind and started training it. I learned that thoughts are tools, not commands. They can be questioned, reshaped, and redirected. That realization gave me a sense of agency I had never experienced before. This chapter is about understanding that saving yourself is not only about changing actions, but about changing the inner dialogue that guides those actions. When you change the way you think, you don't change life overnight, but you change the direction it moves in. And sometimes, direction is everything. Chapter 8. Discipline when motivation is gone. I used to believe that motivation was the engine of change. I waited for it, searched for it, and blamed its absence for my lack of progress. When motivation appeared, I felt hopeful and energized, convinced that this time would be different. When it disappeared, I felt frustrated and discouraged, telling myself that I would continue once the feeling returned. For a long time, this cycle controlled my actions. I didn't realize that by depending on motivation, I was giving control of my life to something unstable and temporary. Motivation is emotional. It rises when things feel exciting and disappears when things feel difficult. Life, however, does not move according to emotional comfort. Progress requires consistency, and consistency does not depend on how you feel in the moment. Understanding this was uncomfortable because it removed another excuse. If motivation was not required, then waiting for it made no sense. What I needed was discipline, not as punishment, but as structure. At first, discipline felt cold and restrictive. It didn't inspire me, it didn't make me feel powerful. It felt mechanical and unromantic. Doing things without wanting to felt unnatural. But slowly, I began to understand that discipline was not about forcing myself to suffer. It was about choosing long-term self-respect over short-term comfort. It was about showing up even when my emotions suggested I shouldn't. I noticed how often I negotiated with myself. I told myself I would start tomorrow, that today was an ideal, that I deserved rest before effort. These conversations felt reasonable, but they added up to inaction. Discipline meant ending those negotiations. It meant deciding once and acting consistently instead of deciding every day based on how I felt. That shift alone reduced mental exhaustion. Fewer decisions meant less resistance. Discipline also taught me humility. There were days when my effort was minimal, my focus weak, and my results unimpressive. Discipline didn't ask for perfection. It asked for presence. It asked me to do something, even if that something felt small. Over time, those small actions accumulated into momentum. Momentum didn't come from feeling ready, it came from repetition. I learned that discipline creates trust. Every time I followed through on a commitment to myself, no matter how small, I rebuilt self-trust that had been damaged by years of inconsistency. That trust became more motivating than motivation itself. I no longer relied on excitement to move forward. I relied on identity. I began to see myself as someone who shows up, even when it's uncomfortable. There were still days when I felt uninspired, tired, or doubtful. Discipline didn't remove those days. It gave me a way to move through them without stopping. I stopped asking whether I felt like continuing and started asking whether continuing aligned with the person I wanted to become. That question shifted the focus from emotion to intention. Discipline also helped me separate effort from outcome. I learned to value consistency over results, especially in the beginning. Results are delayed. Effort is immediate. When I measured success by effort rather than outcome, I stayed engaged longer. This perspective protected me from discouragement and kept me grounded in the process. This chapter is about understanding that motivation is unreliable, but discipline is dependable. Motivation may start the journey, but discipline carries it forward. Saving myself was not about feeling inspired every day. It was about deciding that my future mattered enough to act even when inspiration was absent. When motivation disappeared, discipline remained. And in that quiet, steady presence, I found progress. Not dramatic progress, not instant change, but real, lasting movement in the direction of the life I was slowly learning to build. Chapter 9. Falling Again, but with Awareness. I used to believe that progress meant never falling again. I thought that once I became disciplined, self-aware, and intentional, I would move forward in a straight line. I imagined growth as a clean path, free of repetition and mistakes. Reality taught me otherwise. Falling again was not a failure of the process, it was part of it. The difference this time was not that I stopped falling, but that I began to understand why it happened. There were moments when old habits returned quietly. I skipped routines I had committed to. I delayed actions I knew were important. I slipped back into comfort without fully realizing it at first. At one time, these moments would have triggered harsh self-criticism and discouragement.
I would have told myself that nothing had changed, that I was back at the beginning, that all my effort had been pointless. This time, something was different. I noticed the fall instead of denying it. Awareness changed everything. Instead of reacting emotionally, I observed. I paid attention to what led me there. Fatigue, distraction, emotional overload, unrealistic expectations. These were not excuses, but explanations. Understanding them helped me respond with intention rather than shame. Shame had never helped me grow. It had only pushed me further into avoidance. Falling again taught me that discipline does not remove vulnerability, it manages it. I was still human. I still experienced doubt, resistance, and emotional fluctuation. The goal was no longer perfection, but recovery. How quickly could I return to alignment after slipping? How honestly could I face what happened without lying to myself? I learned that falling without awareness leads to cycles. Falling with awareness leads to learning. Each setback became information. It showed me where my systems were weak, where my boundaries were unclear, and where my expectations were unrealistic. Instead of asking why I failed, I asked what I needed to adjust. This shift required compassion without softness. I allowed myself to acknowledge difficulty without using it as a reason to stop. I accepted imperfection without surrendering commitment. That balance was new to me. Before, I either punished myself or excused myself. Now, I corrected myself. Awareness also made me honest about patterns. I saw how easily small compromises could grow into full disengagement if left unaddressed. I learned to catch myself earlier, to respond before a fall became a collapse. This did not make me immune to mistakes, but it made me resilient.
There was something grounding about knowing that falling again did not erase progress. Growth was not stored in flawless performance, but in accumulated awareness. Each time I returned, I did so with more understanding than before. That understanding became stability. This chapter is about redefining success. Success is not never falling. Success is noticing when you do and choosing to stand back up with clarity rather than frustration. Awareness transforms setbacks into steps forward. Saving myself did not mean becoming someone who never struggles. It meant becoming someone who understands their struggle and no longer lets it define them. Falling again was inevitable. Falling without awareness was no longer acceptable.
Chapter 10. Rebuilding Myself Step by Step. Rebuilding myself did not begin with a dramatic transformation or a sudden breakthrough. It began quietly, almost unnoticed, through small decisions that felt ordinary but carried intention. I had learned by then that trying to change everything at once only led to frustration and collapse. What I needed was not intensity, but consistency, not ambition, but patience. Rebuilding was not about creating a new identity overnight. It was about restoring trust with myself one step at a time. I started by simplifying my expectations. Instead of demanding major results, I focused on small actions I could repeat. I chose routines that were manageable, not impressive. This shift was humbling. Part of me wanted visible proof of progress, something I could point to as evidence that I was changing. But I learned that real rebuilding often looks unimpressive from the outside. It looks like showing up when no one is watching and choosing effort without applause. Each small action became a quiet promise kept. Waking up when I said I would, completing tasks even when they felt boring, returning to routines after breaks without drama. These moments may have seemed insignificant individually, but together they rebuilt something essential: self-trust. For years, I had weakened my relationship with myself through inconsistency. Rebuilding required me to become reliable again. I also learned to work with my energy instead of fighting it. There were days when progress was slow and focus limited. Instead of forcing productivity, I adjusted my pace. I stopped interpreting low energy as failure. Rebuilding is not linear, and pushing too hard often causes more damage than progress. Respecting my limits allowed me to move forward sustainably. Rebuilding also required letting go of urgency. I was used to feeling behind, as if time were running out. That urgency created pressure, and pressure led to shortcuts. Step-by-step rebuilding demanded a different mindset. It asked me to trust the process rather than rush the outcome. Progress measured in months felt slow, but progress measured in years felt meaningful. I paid closer attention to alignment. I asked myself whether my actions matched my values, even in small ways. Rebuilding was not just about discipline, but about direction. Consistency without alignment leads to burnout. Alignment gave purpose to effort and made repetition meaningful.
There were moments when I questioned whether these small steps mattered. When results were delayed, doubt appeared. But I learned to see rebuilding as an investment. You don't see growth immediately when laying a foundation, but without it, nothing stable can stand. Every repeated action was a brick. Every correction was reinforcement. This chapter is about understanding that rebuilding is not glamorous. It is quiet, repetitive, and often invisible. But it is also powerful, because step-by-step progress is sustainable, and sustainability creates lasting change. Saving myself did not mean becoming someone extraordinary. It meant becoming someone consistent, intentional, and patient. And in that steady process, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: stability.
Conclusion. A letter to you. If you have reached this point, it means you stayed. You didn't rush through these pages looking for quick answers or instant motivation. You stayed with the discomfort, the honesty, and the quiet truth that real change is rarely dramatic. That alone tells me something about you. It tells me that somewhere inside you, there is a desire not just to improve your life, but to understand it. Saving myself was never about becoming perfect, fearless, or endlessly confident. It was about choosing awareness over avoidance, responsibility over excuses, and consistency over intensity. It was about accepting that life does not change because we want it to, but because we decide to engage with it differently. The decision to save myself did not remove struggle from my life. It gave my struggle direction. There were days when progress felt invisible, and moments when doubt returned quietly. But I learned that growth does not announce itself, it accumulates. It lives in repeated choices, honest reflection, and the willingness to return even after falling. I learned that strength is not loud, it is steady. If you are still waiting for the right moment, the right feeling, or the right sign, let this be it. Not because everything is clear, but because clarity comes from action, not before it. You do not need to have your life figured out to begin. You only need to be willing to stop abandoning yourself. No one is coming to save you, and that is not a sentence of isolation. It is an invitation to ownership. It means your life is not dependent on permission, rescue, or perfect conditions. It means you are allowed to start where you are, with what you have, as you are.
Saving yourself is not a one-time decision. It is a practice, a quiet commitment you renew daily, sometimes imperfectly, sometimes reluctantly, but honestly. Some days you will move forward, some days you will pause, some days you will fall. What matters is that you no longer disappear from your own life. If this book has given you anything, I hope it has given you permission. Permission to be honest with yourself, permission to grow at your own pace, permission to let go of expectations that do not serve you, and permission to believe that change does not require becoming someone else. It requires becoming present. The moment you decide to save yourself is not the end of your struggle. It is the beginning of your relationship with yourself, and that relationship
built with patience, discipline, and awareness, is the most important work you will ever do. Your life does not need to be extraordinary to be meaningful. It needs to be yours, and that is enough.